and welcome to yet another episode of Dynamic CISO Talk Show. We have been bringing to our listeners some really renowned world-class security and privacy experts through this show. Information security, as we know, has become kind of non-negotiable for any and every organization that's in business, in public welfare, in healthcare, or otherwise. Even the individuals are paying more attention to the data security and breaches that are rampant across geographies. With the growing influence of cloud computing in enterprises and an exponential rise in adoption in all domains, whether it is software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, or everything as a service, cloud has become the quintessential, or if we may say so, the default backbone of technology infrastructure today. However, with this rise in adoption comes a lot of challenges, and we are all aware, have an idea of what those challenges are. Right from cloud misconfigurations, lack of an appropriate cloud security architecture, insufficient identity, credential, and access management tools, account hijacking, insecure interfaces and APIs, weak control planes, and many such issues make cloud very susceptible to breaches and threats. In an Oracle KPMG Cloud Threat Report, which was released last year, it was found that nearly 90% of organizations are using software as a service, 76% are using infrastructure as a service today, 50% expect to move all their data to the cloud in the next 2 years. I mean, these data points are known to all of us, and they are growing exponentially. And in such a scenario where the thrust is on the cloud adoption, it is even more important to also think, act, and proactively defend the crown jewels in the cloud. Now, to discuss a lot of these key issues and also talk about some key innovations and announcements that Oracle is going to do in the cloud security space, we have today with us Fred Kost. Fred is the Vice President, Cross-Platform Security, Analytics, and Linux at Oracle. Welcome, Fred. It's a pleasure to have you on this show today. How are you doing?
Doing great, Rahul. Thanks for having me today.
Wonderful. So now before we begin talking about business, tell us about yourself, your work portfolio. What do you do?
Sure. So I lead a product marketing team at Oracle. I cover security, as you mentioned, analytics, sort of think of it as business analytics, Linux, as well as I have a team cross-platform that looks at across solutions. And so kind of a broad mix of product marketing professionals. But I have to say, Rahul, my real passion is security. I've been involved in security for quite a long time. I've been at some industry leaders like Checkpoint. I've been in some very early stage companies that have gone on to do well. So you did a great intro of how important and critical security is, and that continues to be a big passion of mine.
It's great to know, and keeping that in mind, all my focus today will be on topics related to security and what Oracle is doing in this space. So, cybersecurity, data security, breaches, data theft, data privacy, all of these are now core boardroom discussion topics. Let's begin by knowing from you how these issues are causing a worry as far as trust and compliance issues are concerned.
Yeah, it's a good, your intro, you talked about cloud, and I think that's one of the interesting intersections is, you mentioned some of the research we've done with our cloud threat report, and what we found is, there's been a shift. Most organizations, years ago believed the cloud wasn't secure, they had concerns, and that's really flipped. They now believe the cloud can be more secure than what they can do on premises in their own data center. I say can be because you highlighted some of the things that could go wrong as you move to the cloud if you're not careful. So clearly there's the shift there. And the areas around trust and compliance are hugely critical. We're asking customers, trust us. We're going to protect your data just like you would. We're going to, go the great distance to make sure there's not a breach, there's not all the list of things that could go wrong that you mentioned earlier. We're going to do our best to make sure those happen. So, we're really asking our customers to trust us with their data. And then when it comes to compliance, there's a long list of compliance mandates, all meant really to make sure you're operating as securely as you can. Again, as a customer, they're looking for a cloud provider that takes those seriously, can not only check the box, but know that they've been through a rigorous process to meet all the certification requirements to take away some of that risk. And so that compliance and trust are very, very critical when picking a cloud provider.
Absolutely. And if I were to ask you to make a realistic assessment of cloud adoption as it is happening today versus an appropriate cloud security architecture, what would be the key areas of concern that you think the enterprises are facing? How has the rise in cloud adoption made a CISO's role tougher and more complex?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things I would highlight. I think one is cloud is a completely different model. So if you've been doing things a certain way on premises for a long time, you have your favorite firewall, you have your favorite product. Cloud is, to a certain degree, a very different model. The responsibilities of what falls upon the customer, what falls upon the cloud provider are different. The technology are different. How you manage them, they can be very different. So it can be very different there. So I think that's one shift. I think also operating in a hybrid environment. Rahul, some organizations are cloud native and they can say everything's in the cloud, but a large number of organizations are hybrid. They're in a process of moving from on-premises into cloud, and they may have some of those things long-term that operate sort of in both of those camps. And so I think the different operating model, the hybrid nature, and then I think the last one I would say is with cloud, it offers great opportunity, but you have to sort of be careful. You mentioned misconfigurations and some of the things. What we've seen, in the last, let's call it 16, 18 months, go 2 years, many organizations have had a misconfiguration which led to a data disclosure. They've had something that went wrong that really the cloud architecture was built to protect that, but the implementation or how the organization implemented something caused them to have a mishap. Well, I'd say those are probably the top three kind of concerns that organizations are facing as they build out a cloud security architecture and move to the cloud.
Yeah, so you briefly mentioned about the misconfigurations. So if we go by some very cliched statements, then supposedly by 2025, almost all of the cloud breaches will have a root cause in misconfigurations or mistakes made by the end users. Why is it so rampant? Is it due to lack of insights, due to lack of analytics available? Is it due to lack of visibility, or is it something else?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that work there. One is the whole of all of the incidents. Cloud providers are very good at building, a consistent infrastructure, operating it very consistently, and taking away the risk from some of the security vulnerabilities that we humans introduce. And so I think that makes the pool of events much smaller, which leads those events where there is human error, human mistakes, are going to be the ones that stand out. To your point, 5% or so, might be the cloud provider, but a majority are going to be human mistakes, misconfigurations. And I think that's what we're wrestling with, is how do we help those organizations not make a mistake, not make a configuration mistake? Because again, it's either people overlook something, forget to patch. People open up a port to do some development operations, they forget to close that port, and something happens. Those are just very common mistakes that could leave you vulnerable. Not necessarily a problem with cloud technology. It's really more of an operational human error kind of situation. So those are the things that we need to tackle and address.
Great. So let's now talk about Oracle's cloud infrastructure and how does it address the threats both from known sources and unknown. And how do you, deal with, or how does Oracle perceive the threat landscape today, and how does it prepare its customers who are using Oracle cloud infrastructure to deal better with them?
Yeah, so I think one thing is, very much foundational from the start. We've taken a very security first approach to security in our cloud. We may have the benefit of, we have a Gen 2 cloud, so having a slightly later start or a second start gave us an opportunity to really learn how to build in security and what's needed to have a very, very architecturally well, thought out security plan for our cloud. So lots of isolation and least privilege, a lot of core security principles that were baked in. The other part of that is, we've built a cloud that's running, we've been running applications in the cloud. We've been running a lot of cloud business hyperscale kind of applications for quite a long time. And so we also brought that knowledge. How do you do security and make this easier at hyperscale? So we've done one thing differently, but then we also have an experiential advantage that helps us. And so what we've done with that is really look at how do we build security services that make security, I'm hesitant to say simple, but make it simpler and less complex than it's been in the past. I talked about migrations from complex products on premises into the cloud. We've tried to really break that down and be simpler. The average in our threat report, we found that the average organization has more than 50 discrete security products they're trying to manage. And so how do we sort of bring those together and make it much simpler? The other thing we're trying to do is, some of those misconfigurations you talked about, or things that go wrong and lead to a data breach or create a vulnerability which leads to a successful attack, they're just not sure what to do, or they don't have that guidance. And so we're trying through our products and services and security to be very prescriptive and give our customers guidance on what you need to do. Rahul, this is super critical data. Okay, you should put it here in this location. You should configure these things this way. And oh, by the way, you should never turn this on in this configuration. So we're taking away some of that risk, or allowing the customer to make a bad decision, and trying to help them and be prescriptive from a technology perspective. And then the last part that we're doing is, security is an interesting thing because it's hard to say it has an ROI. Like I spent this money on security, now I'm making more money. It's more of an insurance kind of risk adjustment purchase. So sometimes that becomes a challenge to cost justify making bigger security investments. So from a strategy perspective, we're including as many and most security services into our OCI stack of services, so our customers don't have to make that economic decision. So way upstream, early in their deployment and architectural process, they can build in the security, knowing that as they deploy and go live, they've baked it in, they built it in, and they don't have to make those economic trade-offs. And so those are fewer things that we're doing, or how we're approaching security to avoid some of those things you laid out in the beginning of our conversation.
Excellent. Now that brings me to some very recent, new announcement that Oracle is making, which includes OCI web application firewall for flexible load balancers, vulnerability scanning service, and Oracle Cloud Infrastructure Bastion. And I will talk about some more a little later. So one by one, if you can explain what these launches are all about, what these products are all about, and how are they going to help enterprise secure their Oracle Cloud infrastructure?
Sure. I'll do a quick description of each of those, and feel free to jump in or ask for more clarification. So in the case of the web application firewall, your audience is probably very familiar with web application firewalls. And so the innovation there isn't so much that, hey, we have a web application firewall. We've had that for some time. What we've done is we've moved the web application firewall onto our load balancer service. So now, instead of way out at the edge, we've actually deployed in load balancers. And so now we have visibility of not only north-south traffic coming in that might be attacking applications, but also east-west. And so we get much greater coverage looking for web vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting, things that are going after web logic of applications. And so it's a ease of deployment and a coverage model boost for the web application firewall. The second one we're announcing, okay.
Sorry, if I interject here and ask you, how different it will be, or how much more advanced it will be if we compare it with the existing web solutions, for example, from F5 or Cloudflare or Imperva.
Yeah. So I think if you look at a lot of web application firewalls, they're looking, even we talk about in the blog post announcing this, we're using the OWASP. We're looking for common vulnerabilities, and so all the web app firewalls are kind of, we know the threats and what we're looking for. So some of our uniqueness here is, one, putting on the load balancer, so we've made it much easier to deploy it. And the other thing that each of these services, I think, ties back into from innovation perspective, and we may have spoken with you in the past about two things we announced almost a year ago, and one of those was CloudGuard. The other was Max Security Zones. But CloudGuard is becoming our single pane of glass sort of security portal where all information is coming in to present to our customers, but also we're making decisions and helping them, simplify that security and offer that prescriptive advice that I spoke of earlier. So that's another part of the uniqueness here, is pulling this kind of information into CloudGuard so they can, either configure, monitor, or do some sort of remediation or something. So that actually applies to all four of the services to a certain degree that we're going to talk about today.
Okay, so let's move on to the other announcements and other solutions like vulnerability scanning service, Bastion, and Oracle Cloud Infrastructure certificates.
Sure. So the second we're announcing is a vulnerability scanning service. And again, that might not ring the bell on, wow, that's a huge innovation. Again, vulnerability scanners commonly look for CVEs and indexes of well-known vulnerabilities or misconfiguration from CIS benchmarks and such. And so essentially that's what we're doing. We're looking for both network-based and host-based vulnerabilities. Again, part of the uniqueness here is we're bringing that into CloudGuard. So as we find problems, misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, we can report them into CloudGuard, prioritize them, present them to our customer. In many cases, if they've so decided, we can auto remediate them so we can fix that problem. So one of the things we have in CloudGuard is the notion of a recipe, nothing to do with cooking. It's strictly a kind of a configuration file. And so as we have recipes and something is scanned and doesn't comply to that recipe, we can actually automate that remediation if you've so decided. So you have the option to auto remediate or manually go fix it. But that integration back to CloudGuard is part of what makes this unique from a vulnerability scanning perspective. And this is extremely critical. We talked earlier about, one of the problems is human error or not patching or having systems you missed that either aren't patched or have a misconfiguration. This is constantly scanning, looking for those problems, be it an unpatched vulnerability, a misconfiguration, reporting them and helping you fix and remediate that before it leads to a breach or some bigger problem.
All right.
All right.
And what about the Bastion?
All right. The third one's my favorite because when I talk about Bastion, many people say, "What's a Bastion?" or something. So fascinated by that. My own marketing peers are like, "A Bastion? That's a terrible marketing name. Why would you name a product a Bastion?" But a Bastion technically is really, think of it as this jump host, and so I need a secure, controlled place to enter the network. And then behind that, I put my, operating servers, database servers, things I really want to protect. And so, we're providing a Bastion service so that customers can use SSH to connect to that Bastion host, and then from there, connect to other servers, within their environment. And so it's critically important, one, exposing public IP facing, addressable devices on the internet is a highly risky, dangerous thing, even with good credentials. Credentials are stolen, people, scan and find these. And so one, this puts them behind a very tightly controlled resource. Person leaves, configuration changes, you've got much tighter control. The other thing here is, and this is a common thing, I know from my years of background with firewalls, access rules change and drift, and they don't always get cleaned up. And so there's a sort of ephemeral time nature here too, in that you don't want those credentials to last forever. You want to renew them, change them, and so that also keeps prevents that drift of configuration or access control. And so Bastion, again, it isn't necessarily the largest of innovations, but it's a very, very critical security piece, security service for offering customers that that high level of security need to do in that kind of environment.
What do the OCI customers need to have to use the Bastion service to connect to their private resources?
So if they have, this actually, the other thing is many of these services are all available in our free tier, which is a free tier you can use to build, experiment, and in paid tenancies. And so if you have, let's say you have either a free tier or a paid tenancy, and you have hosts set up and configured, the OC Bastion service essentially is another service you spin up, think of it as a networking service, network configuration. So you configure it to connect the host on the back end within your VPC or your virtual network. And on the front end, you configure SSH access to those end clients who are going to log into the Bastion and get access. And so from that perspective, it's a fairly simple, straightforward configuration to provide that access, if you will.
Okay, and then finally about the certificates.
Yeah, then the final one is certificates, which again are a kind of really basic thing you have to have, but we're integrating that as a service in that, having good certificate hygiene is critically important. Expiring certificates, rotating certificates, that's good security hygiene. But at the same time, forgetting to rotate certificates expiring can create downtime and tremendous service disruption. And so we're integrating certificate management into our security services so that it's tightly integrated with CloudGuard, so we can manage certificates. We can generate the certificate, or if Rahul has a certificate generation, you can bring your own certificate, but we'll help you manage that. So for instance, in CloudGuard, if you have certificates getting ready to expire, we can help you manage that. Make sure you know that, you rotate those out. Or if you have a rotation policy, going back to some of your compliance certifications or policies, we can help manage that and help you with that rotation policy. So this is really meant to, again, that theme of simplifying and giving guidance, make the whole process of issuing, managing, and revoking certificates much simpler to manage and operate. Many of these services, I'll go back to the beginning of our conversation. We talked about, many organizations have 50 discrete security products. So one of the advantages here, even though some of these things may seem like, hey, this is a basic service. I have a Bastion, a really cool thing I've now learned about, scanning service, certificate service. But if you're trying to do all these things with 50 different tools, things are going to go wrong. It's going to take more resources. It's a very challenging environment to manage all these things and stitch them together. But when you can bring more of these together under one sort of management plane, in our case with CloudGuard and common cloud services, single console, it gets much easier for the organization to manage their security, have great security hygiene, and lessen the risk that they're going to make a mistake or miss something that's going to lead to an open vulnerability in their environment.
So finally, Fred, as you've been underlining the fact that there are so many discrete cybersecurity products that exist in an enterprise environment to protect different workloads, different applications, different cloud instances. However, the fact is that security is considered to be foundational and has to be built in, and the users shouldn't idly have a trade-off between security and the cost. Going forward, looking into the future where the cloud adoption is going to be even more rampant, even more aggressive, how do you visualize the future, and how do you think that security should be the primemost consideration for the CISOs and the CIOs?
Yeah, so I think their security life, fortunately, I think it's going to get better. Perhaps easier is a good word. I think it'll get simpler and better for them. I mean, I think there's a lot of underlying technologies. If you look at what we're doing, with things in machine learning and recognizing patterns and building more automated intelligence into how we do security, it's going to help them. Sometimes security, it's finding the needle in the haystack, and so all the things that we can do to really get much more intelligent, automated, is going to help the security professionals, but also that automation around helping them configure and make good decisions. Again, going back to that, most cloud errors through 2025 will be the customer's fault, and many of those are humans. So the more we can give the guidance and take away the reliance on the human, not that the humans aren't involved. I know security professionals, we don't like to automate things and let the machine completely make a decision. But for instance, we present Rahul with two options. We've seen all of this. Here's what we see. Do you want to fix it? Yes or no, versus relying on Rahul to go find these things and then fix them. So I think as a security professional, a lot of those underlying technologies are going to make security, much easier and less cumbersome to manage. Just something simple, like one of the things we announced with CloudGuard was something called maximum security zones. Not a super complex sort of idea, but if Rahul comes to OCI, our cloud, and you have some, either very critical data or workloads that, hey, this is the crown jewels, these are things that are very important to me, we can allow you to put those into a maximum security zone. So it's a pre-configured, those recipes I mentioned earlier are predefined, and the security environment there is extremely tight. Access control, privileged access, limited access, making sure there's no public IPs, all the things you would want to make sure happen to really protect that data, we're doing that automatically for you. So things like that are going to make it much easier for organizations to have really good security hygiene and posture as they move to the cloud.
Excellent. I think that's all from my side. It was nice to have you on this show, Fred, and great information shared. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks for having me, Rahul.